street was nearly empty, wet from an afternoon drizzle. Storefront lights glimmered on the slick pavement like strands of gold. Daniel adjusted his backpack and slowed his pace. He'd left the studio late, his mind still full of charcoal smudges and unfinished sketches, when he noticed her. She stood a few yards ahead, framed by the glow of a street lamp. Long coat the color of dark wine, hair gathered loosely at the nape, yet spilling forward with the breeze. She wasn't just pretty. She had the kind of presence that made passers-by check themselves, as though they were underdressed. Even at 40, she radiated a self-possession Daniel had only seen in film scenes. But there was also a flicker of distraction in her posture, like she'd walked out of one life and hadn't yet entered the next. He was about to pass when she turned. "Excuse me," she said, a polite, low tone. "Do you know if Montrose Street runs parallel to this one?" Her voice startled him out of his thoughts. Yeah, 2 blocks over." He pointed, but didn't move. "I'm heading that way." "That's all right," she replied automatically, though her eyes stayed on him a second too long. There was a faint scent, jasmine and something citrus, drifting with her words. "I don't mind," Daniel said, falling into step beside her. He wasn't sure why. He usually didn't do this, didn't follow strangers, especially older women with rings glinting on their fingers. But something about the small frown at the corner of her mouth pulled him in. They walked a few paces. The only sounds were the soft slap of her heels, his sneakers squeaking, a neon sign buzzing overhead. "You're not from here," he said, trying to keep it light. She glanced sideways, lips curving faintly. "I live here, just rarely on this side of town." "Oh," he laughed once, too quickly. "You looked lost." "I am," she said, but it felt like she wasn't talking about streets anymore. A gust of wind blew her hair across her face. Without thinking, Daniel reached to tuck it back. She stopped short, eyes narrowing just enough to warn him. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't touch me." His hand froze midair, but she didn't step back. The space between them held like a drawn string. He lowered his voice, pulse hammering. "Then why aren't you moving away?" Her breath caught. He could see it in the rise of her chest under the coat. For a beat, she didn't answer. Then she turned, brushing past him as if nothing had happened, but her shoulder grazed his. The touch was brief, accidental, but it left his fingers tingling. They reached the corner. She paused under the awning of a closed cafe, rain dripping from the sign. "Montrose is straight ahead," he murmured, nodding. "Thank you." She didn't look at him this time. Her hand gripped the strap of her handbag as if to steady herself. Then she crossed the street quickly and slipped into a small boutique with frosted windows and a gold handle. Daniel stayed on the sidewalk, backpack heavy on one shoulder, watching the door swing shut behind her. Through the glass, he could only see shapes. Her coat, a blur of movement as she spoke to someone inside. He realized his heart was pounding, his palm still warm where he'd almost touched her. He should keep walking. Instead, he stood in the drizzle, staring at the boutique's faint glow, wondering why she'd asked for directions when she clearly already knew where she was going. Daniel had never imagined himself in a place like this. Elena's apartment was a soft geometry of warm light and glass, tall windows overlooking the city, a faint soundtrack of rain sliding down the panes. Books stacked in careful disorder, candles glowing in mismatched holders. The faint smell of bergamot tea mixed with her perfume. He'd only come to drop off a folder of archival notes she'd promised to lend him. She had opened the door barefoot, coat hung carelessly on a chair, silk blouse half tucked into loose trousers. All her polish was still there, but the edges felt softer here, like seeing an actress after the curtain fell. "Sorry about the mess," she said, ushering him in. He smiled. "This is not a mess." She gestured toward the dining table where papers were scattered, old exhibition programs, photographs of paintings, some annotated in her slanted handwriting. "I was reorganizing the archives. You can help me if you want." He hesitated, then set down his backpack and sat opposite her. They began sorting quietly, slipping papers into folders. He tried to focus, but his senses kept tilting toward her. The flick of her wrist as she wrote, the small exhale when she found a misplaced page, the way the dim lamp carved gold along her collarbone. "Do you always keep this much at home?" he asked. "Sometimes I like to work away from the gallery," she said, eyes still on the papers. "Less noise." He nodded. She glanced up. "Less people," she added, almost an afterthought. Something in her voice made him look at her more closely. Her smile had a tiny fracture in it, there for a second and gone. He realized how much he was cataloging. The way she pressed her lips before speaking, the slight tremor of her hand when she reached for tea. It was like watching a painting and noticing all the brushstrokes, the hidden underlayers. She laughed softly at one of his clumsy jokes about art hoarding, and without thinking, touched his hand. Just her fingertips against the back of his knuckles, light as static. She withdrew immediately, eyes flicking away. He tried to steady his breathing. You don't have to. I know, she interrupted. Sorry. Habit. They continued sorting, but the air had shifted. The rain outside grew heavier, a slow percussion against the windows. In the silence between them, Daniel could hear his own heartbeat. She glanced at the clock on the wall, then at him. You've done enough, she murmured. It's late. He began stacking the last folder, preparing to stand. She watched him, fingers tightening. On her teacup. You don't have to go yet, she said quietly, almost as if testing the words. Stay a little longer. Daniel froze, the folder halfway into his bag. In the lamplight her expression was unreadable, not an invitation exactly, not a dismissal either. Just an opening he hadn't expected. Rain drummed softly against the tall windows, a steady whisper over the city. Daniel stood in the hallway outside her door, balancing 2 cups of coffee, still warm enough to fog the lids. He told himself it was nothing, just a gesture, returning the favor from the night they met. But his heartbeat said otherwise. When Elena opened the door, she was barefoot again, hair pinned up messily this time, a faint smear of charcoal at the edge of her thumb. You're going to spoil me, she said, taking the cup. Her voice carried a sleepiness he'd never heard before. You always look like you're working, he said, stepping inside. Figured you could use a break. The apartment was dim except for the soft lamp near the window. Rain traced slow, clear lines down the glass. She went to straighten a curtain that had slipped off its hook, tugging the fabric up. He set the coffees down on the table, walked over without thinking. Here, let me. He reached for the same fold of fabric at the same moment she did. Their fingers collided, a dry spark even against the damp air. Neither of them pulled back immediately. Her hand was warm, the nails short, a faint tremor running through them. She cleared her throat. Thanks, she murmured, eyes darting to the window. I keep meaning to fix this. But she didn't move her hand until he slowly withdrew his. He felt the absence like a cold patch on his skin. He forced a small laugh. You're always saving paintings. I guess curtains too. She gave a quick, distracted smile, but her gaze stayed on him a second too long. Don't make me laugh when I'm tired. I lose my filter. Before he could ask what she meant, her phone buzzed on the table. The sound was sharp in the soft room. She picked it up, frowned at the screen, thumb hovering. He saw only a man's name, no message preview, before she flipped the phone face down without replying. Sorry, she said, almost to herself. Where were we? Daniel sat down on the arm of the sofa, pretending to study the coffee cup, but his mind replayed the way her hand had felt against his. He wanted to ask who had called, but the question stuck in his throat. Instead, he asked about a photograph on her shelf, and she told a short, half-hearted story that trailed off before the punchline. The rain deepened, tapping harder against the glass like a muted applause. Elena stood by the window, sipping her coffee, silhouette outlined in dim light. Daniel rose slowly, unsure whether to leave or stay. I should, he began, gesturing vaguely toward the door. She didn't answer right away, still looking out at the city. The silence stretched, full of things neither of them could say. He lingered in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other still warm from her touch, unsure if leaving was possible anymore. The apartment felt smaller at night. The lamps were turned low, casting long shadows across the walls. Rain still clung to the windows in faint rivulets, but the storm had moved on. The city's noise had thinned to a hush. Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor, papers forgotten, watching the way Elena cradled a glass of water like it was something delicate. She had slipped off her shoes hours ago. Her blouse was loose, collar slightly open, exposing the thin silver chain at her throat. In the dim light her face looked softer, but also older in a way he hadn't noticed before. Not tired, exactly, but holding something heavy. You ever feel like you're disappearing? She asked suddenly. He blinked. What do you mean? She stared at the glass. You spend years building something, a reputation, a marriage, a life. And then one day you catch yourself in the mirror and realize you're not sure who you're building it for anymore. A dry laugh escaped her. God, that sounds melodramatic. It doesn't, Daniel said quietly. He wanted to reach for her hand, but stopped himself halfway, fingers curling against his knee. Elena glanced up, eyes glinting in the low light. Sometimes I'm scared I've already made all my choices, that what's left is just rearranging the furniture. She shifted, pulling her knees up onto the sofa, bare toes peeking from under her trousers. I never tell anyone that. He swallowed hard. I'm glad you told me. The words felt clumsy. What he wanted to say, I see you, I can't stop thinking about you, jammed at the back of his throat. Instead, he stared at the rug, tracing the pattern with his gaze. You're quiet, she murmured. I don't want to say the wrong thing, he admitted. She tilted her head. Or the right thing? Their eyes met. For a second the room tilted, like a frame slipping off its hook. Every inch of air between them seemed alive, humming. He could see the pulse at her throat, the way she gripped the cushion with her free hand, as if bracing for something. He shifted closer on the floor, knee brushing the edge of the sofa. Elena, he began, voice low. She turned toward him, expectant. The words rose, a confession, a warning, but at the last moment he swallowed them, shaking his head slightly. What? She asked, almost a whisper. Nothing. His voice cracked. She exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and disappointment. Slowly she set the glass on the table. Their hands hovered near each other, not touching but close enough that the warmth passed between them like a current. Neither spoke. The apartment's dimness wrapped around them, heavy and intimate. The clock ticked faintly in the kitchen. Charged silence filled the room, unspoken tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Daniel had meant to grab another folder from her bookshelf, nothing more. But tucked between two exhibition catalogs was a photo, loose and worn at the corners. It slipped out and fluttered onto the rug at his feet. He crouched to pick it up. It was Elena, 20-something, sunlit and unguarded, hair loose over her shoulders, leaning against a stone wall somewhere warm. No rings. No lines of tiredness around her eyes. A brightness that startled him. Behind him, her voice, careful with that. He turned. She stood a few feet away, arms crossed, but not in anger, more like bracing herself. The lamplight carved a pale arc along her cheekbone. For a moment, she looked like two versions of herself at once. The woman in the picture and the one watching him hold it. Sorry, he said, handing it back. It just fell out. She took the photo slowly, fingers brushing his. I haven't looked at this in years. Her eyes stayed on it, but her voice softened into something almost brittle. That was Lisbon. I'd just taken a job there. Thought I was invincible. What happened? Daniel asked quietly. She hesitated. I met someone. Older, of course. Married, of course. Told myself it was temporary. Told myself I was different. A quick, humorless smile flickered. I wasn't. Daniel didn't know what to say. The photo trembled slightly in her hand as she went on, almost whispering. When it ended, it was like losing air. I promised myself never again. Never put myself in that position. Never. She trailed off, finally looking up at him. Their eyes locked, tension gathering in her gaze. He could see the fear there, and something else, recognition. Like a mirror tilted between them. He stepped closer, words spilling before he could stop them. I don't want to lose what's here. It wasn't a declaration, exactly. More a plea, low enough that it barely reached her. Her breath caught. She pressed the photo to her chest as if to shield herself, eyes searching his face for an answer he didn't have. For a long beat neither moved. Rain traced thin paths down the glass behind them. A candle flickered on the table, its flame bending toward them like it, too. Wanted to know what would happen next. Daniel's hand hovered at his side. He wanted to touch her, to promise something, but every promise felt like a crack waiting to split. She stayed where she was, shoulders tense, still clutching the image of her younger self. They stood frozen, both of them, as if the room itself had turned to glass. Fragile vulnerability stretched between them, one wrong motion and it would shatter. The sliding door whispered shut behind them. Cool air swept through the gap, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and distant street food. Below, the city glittered, rows of amber windows, slow red streams of taillights, a few neon signs blinking in and out. Daniel leaned against the railing, palms damp against the cold metal. Elena stepped out a moment later, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The soft hiss of the breeze teased a strand of hair across her face. She tucked it back without looking at him. "You should be inside," she said, but her tone held no force. "I needed air," he replied. His voice sounded rougher than he meant. He stared at the skyline, the thin slip of river, anything but her. And maybe courage. She glanced at him, eyebrow raised slightly. Courage for what? He exhaled. The night felt huge around them, the distance between his heartbeat and hers almost audible. "I keep telling myself it's just admiration. Curiosity. Whatever." His fingers tightened on the rail. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Elena." The words landed and stayed there, suspended between them like a bridge he'd just built without knowing if it would hold. She drew in a sharp breath, but didn't move. Her knuckles whitened where she gripped her cardigan. "You don't have to say that," she murmured, eyes fixed on the lights below. "I know," he said softly, "but I can't pretend anymore." For a long moment, the only sound was the low pulse of traffic far beneath them. Her shoulders rose, then fell, as though she were steadying herself against an invisible current. "This isn't simple," she said finally. "I told myself I wouldn't do this again. I can't." She trailed off, voice cracking, then caught herself. "You're so young, Daniel. You'll hate me one day for letting this happen." He turned toward her, still gripping the railing. "Then don't let it happen. Tell me to leave. Tell me to stop." "I will." She looked at him then, really looked, eyes glinting in the balcony light. Something flickered through her expression, fear, longing, the echo of old decisions. Her breath caught audibly, chest rising, lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Daniel's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his palms. He reached out, stopping short of her arm, fingers hovering in the cool air. "I don't want to lose this. Even if it's only—" He broke off, unable to finish. Elena stood very still. The city's glow climbed her cheekbones. Her pulse fluttered at her throat. Slowly, as though drawn by gravity she couldn't resist, she leaned in slightly. Not a kiss. Not yet. Just enough to close the space between their shadows. The night around them seemed to pause, holding its breath, leaving them suspended on the edge of whatever would come next. Morning spilled through the tall windows, pale gold over soft pastel walls. The storm had moved on. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and coffee brewing somewhere down the hall. Daniel sat at the edge of the sofa, elbows on his knees, watching dust drift like slow sparks in the sunbeam. Elena stood near the window, her back to him, hair loose again but a little tangled from sleep. She pulled the curtain aside with 2 fingers, looking down at the street below where early commuters wove between puddles. Her reflection in the glass was faint and double, her younger self layered over the woman she was now. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence wasn't charged anymore. It was quieter, heavier, like the last echo after a door closes. "I should go soon," Daniel said. Finally, voice low. She nodded without turning. "I know." He rubbed his hands together, searching for something to say. "Last night." "Was last night," she finished gently. She let the curtain fall back into place and faced him. There was no anger, no shame in her expression, just a kind of settled exhaustion, and something softer underneath. "We don't have to name it." He managed a small, sad smile. "It changes things, though." "Yes." Her gaze held his for a long moment. "Some lines aren't meant to be crossed." She let out a breath, almost a laugh. "But sometimes they already are." The words landed between them like a final brushstroke on a canvas. Not a confession, not a promise, just an acknowledgement. He felt it settle in his chest, a strange mixture of regret and gratitude. She walked past him to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and set it down next to his hand. Her fingers lingered a heartbeat too long on the glass, then withdrew. "You'll be late," she said softly. He stood. The morning light caught the stubble on his jaw, the faint shadows under his eyes. "Will I see you at the gallery?" "Of course," she said. But she didn't smile. Different context, though. He nodded, swallowing whatever rose in his throat. He wanted to tell her he didn't regret it, or that he did. He wanted to ask what it meant. But the apartment already felt like it was closing itself back up around her, restoring order. At the door he paused, looking back. She had returned to the window, one hand gripping the curtain edge. She didn't turn, but he saw her reflection glance toward him just as he stepped out. On the stairwell, The city's noise rose to meet him. He carried the smell of her perfume and the feel of her fingertips like a secret in his pocket. As he reached the street, the morning sun struck his face. He wondered if he should have walked away the night before. Or now? Would you have walked away or stayed? Did you enjoy this story? Would you like to hear next?